Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this IATA webinar on reshaping the passenger process. The webinar will be starting shortly. Just before the webinar begins, I'll be running through a few details. So as I mentioned, the webinar will be starting shortly. We're very pleased to have you with us today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who are wondering if you are connected properly, that's exactly why I am speaking now. I hope that you can hear my voice. Welcome to your webinar. We will be starting the webinar in 2 minutes' time. In the meantime, I do have a few details for the webinar's progress. The first one is that during this webinar, your microphone is muted, so attendees to the webinar are not able to communicate with the presenters and panelists. However, we do have the possibility for you to ask questions. You can ask those questions through the Q&A panel that is available to you, and those questions will be presented onto a screen that we have in front of us here. All questions that are submitted to us are reviewed by our legal panel in order to ensure that they are appropriate for us to be able to answer them. So that's the Q&A panel. There is also a chat panel available to you. You are able to use that to send messages of a more general nature. Now, this is an IATA webinar, so of course it is being undertaken in compliance with our competition law guidelines. There will be no discussion of matters regarding fares, charges, division or sharing of traffic, revenues, or anything else concerning any other competitively sensitive topic. IATA will not answer any questions pertaining to individual policies or commercial decisions and or being subject to bilateral commercial discussions between airlines and their suppliers or customers. Please bear this in mind when you enter your questions into the Q&A panel, as we will not be able to answer anything which would lead to commercially sensitive or commercially private information being shared. So ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready to start, and I would like to introduce to you Mr. Joseph Suidan. He is IATA's Head of Ground Operations, and Joseph will be your moderator for this webinar. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome on board our webinar. Ground staff, please leave the aircraft and cabin crew prepare for takeoff. The aim of our webinar today is to navigate you through the new norm of challenges in restoring the passenger and personnel confidence and how to adapt to the in-flight services. So, before we take off, let's take a look at what has been done and how this, what we call, new norm might impact the passenger experience on board. IATA has developed and published, with the help of our members and stakeholders, guidance material on many different areas of operations, including aircraft cleaning and disinfection, cabin operations, and crew health precautions. This guidance materials is now referenced in the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, under the Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, which is in abbreviation an acronym called the CART. This takeoff guidance is an authoritative and comprehensive framework of risk-based temporary measures for air transport operations during the COVID-19 crisis. We have asked those responsible stakeholders, internally and externally, for developing and coordinating our guidance materials to present our webinar today, and to give you an insight into how they were created, how they link to the ICAO CART guidance, and with a brief insight into how they are implemented. Please join me now in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. David Powell, IATA's medical advisor, to take us through the evidence which supported IATA's position and the medical aspects to our work. Dr. Powell, over to you.
Thanks very much, Joseph, and thanks, Andrew, for the first slide. And hello, everybody. I want to start by saying that the work I'm sharing with you has not been done by me alone, but I have an excellent medical advisory group of about 10 airline chief medical officers who work closely with me, and a bigger group beyond that that also assist from time to time. So when we discuss this whole question of safely flying for passengers, there are really two different considerations. So the first is the question of whether you can complete the flight without significant risk of transmission of the virus on board. And that includes not just the flight, but the other parts of the journey through the airport at both ends, and even transport to and from the airport. But that's what the whole ICAO CART process and the takeoff guidance has been concerned with, is the journey itself and limiting transmission. And therefore IATA was heavily involved in all of those processes, the CART, producing that guidance, and also CAPSCO. But the other question is a more difficult one, and that's one that governments are concerned with, and that's stopping the importation of virus. That's a harder thing to achieve, because now you have to avoid not only transmission on board, but avoid bringing people in who may be incubating the virus and able to pass it on to others. And this leads to questions about quarantine and so on. And this more difficult problem is what's led to our very new situation all around the world, with borders closed, really quite contrary to what was intended by the international health regulations, which always have said that border measures should be very limited and very short term, and that's a far distance from where we are now. So that's the introductory comment. I'll take the next slide, please, Andrew. And it just has a little bit of a delay. So the good news for us is that spread on board is relatively rare. Now, it's difficult to get really accurate data on this, but we've got a fairly good window on this by virtue of the fact that I'm in frequent contact with about 70 of the major airlines in the world, representing about 45% of global passenger traffic. And we have, on a number of occasions, asked them to let us know about any cases they're aware of suspected transmission on board. And furthermore, we've got a smaller group representing about 14% of global passengers that we've been in very direct communication with, and they've told us definitively whether or not they've had any such events. And from all of those, we generated a very small number. So 4 cases of transmission suspected from passenger to crew. 5 instances where one pilot transmitted to another pilot, which could have been on board or on layover, and 3 or 4 only of passenger to passenger transmission. And that is over a period of about 2 months before traffic declined, when passenger numbers were high. And so there were tens of thousands of passenger journeys in that data set. But we weren't entirely confident about that, and worked in more detail with just 4 airlines who had very close contact with their public health authorities, because it is common that the airlines don't always hear back from the public health authorities when there is a possible transmission event. So we worked with those 4 and knew of 1,100 cases where a passenger had become a confirmed case after travel. So that's 1,100 people who were probably contagious at the time of flight, out of about 125,000 total passengers. And from those, there were only 2 cases of passenger to crew and 1 of passenger to passenger transmission suspected. If we compare that with other modes of travel or other spread scenarios like meals shared or living together, you would predict something like 72. It's based on a recently published paper from Shenzhen that looked at transmission in various modes. So that was very encouraging, until we became aware of a couple of other exceptions to this whole thing. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll talk you through one of those. This was a flight in early March from London, UK to Hanoi, Vietnam. And I hope the colours are transmitting okay, but if you look at that seating plan there, and this is a 787, we're looking at business class on the left, and in row 5, seat K, is this is the index case. So this is a 27-year-old woman who flew, and it subsequently became clear that she was unwell at the time of flight. And so she is the initial case. They did aggressive follow-up and contact tracing, and all of the purple rings that you can see there that are within the 2 rows in front and behind are those who became secondary cases after the flight. So within the following few days, they tested positive. The blue rings are ones who were passengers on board but did not become cases. And you'll notice there's also 2 secondary cases, or 2 subsequent cases back in economy as well. There's much we don't know about this because it hasn't yet been published, and this is what we've been able to glean from some publicly available information and some communication through WHO. But this does appear to be a case of spread from one to multiple others. And there's one second multiple spread event that's also currently awaiting publication. That is a shorter flight, about 5 hours. It's a long domestic one. There are a number of primaries related to the same origin, and it appears that at least 5 cases are believed to have been transmitted on board. So in summary, risk is low, but there are exceptions. And I think that's always important to bear in mind. So maybe if we go to the next slide there. Sorry, just do something here. We know that the primary mode of spread is droplet spread, and the primary mechanism there is direct. So infected person breathes out droplets and they are then breathed in directly by somebody who's close by. This occurs most often when the person is symptomatic, but it can, as we know, occur in a couple of days before they're symptomatic, and maybe in about 15% of cases there will be no symptoms, but people can still transmit. The secondary mode of spread is through surfaces. So that's either coughing onto surfaces or touching hands and passing to surfaces, and thereby to the recipient's hands and ultimately to their face and their respiratory tract. So that's an indirect route, much less efficient and much less important overall, but certainly exists. And then, as you'll know from quite a bit of literature just in the last few days, there's been increasing evidence that there's some degree of spread from finer aerosol particles. The difference between aerosols and droplets is that they're small particles which can remain suspended airborne and drift around and travel for further distances or for further time than the droplets, which tend to fall to the ground. So in summary, in-flight spread's uncommon, but it can occur, and one of the other speakers will address this a little bit later, but we think there are some characteristics about the aircraft environment which make that in-flight spread less likely than other environments, and explain that apparently low risk. So next. We'll come back to those points later. So what about the various measures that have been recommended or evaluated for limiting spread on board? And I'll start with the less controversial ones. These are all recommended by both the ICAO Council Task Force and by IATA ourselves. Firstly, temperature screening. This is very widespread, as you know, excuse me. It's limited in its effectiveness because it's not always that sensitive. Somebody has to be having a fever at the time when they go through the measurement device, and they can also mask it with medication. But it certainly caught some of the early cases in this outbreak, and we know from survey data that people are quite reassured by having a temperature screening process in place. It probably also deters people from traveling when they are unwell, because they know that they have a chance of being caught, if you will. The other thing that's very common and non-controversial is that we're asking people if they have the symptoms of COVID at the time of travel, and that's got some effectiveness, but again, it's limited. Some of you will have heard about a flight just within the last week or so, which was from Dubai to Hong Kong. All of the arrivals there are tested, and it was found that there were 26 cases on board. So there was 26 people who were throat swab positive at the time of flight. The entire passenger group were held in quarantine and also tested if they tested initially, and then subsequently if they developed symptoms. And when I wrote these slides, the information was that there have been no secondary cases. Since then, in the last day, it looks like there's possibly one, maybe two, although we think that's incidental, but possibly one who's become a secondary case on board. Not confirmed and not possible to be confirmed, so we don't know for sure. And remember, those passengers will all have been wearing masks for that flight. Cleaning and disinfection, my colleague Eva will cover later in some detail. And of course, there's a number of measures that are applied to crew on layover. And so these are the less controversial measures. If we go to the next one, thanks, Andrew. Now, more controversial here is the question of physical distancing. And those of you in the US will know that this is a big hot topic at the moment. What about the empty middle seat? We presume that this would have some effect of limiting risk, but this really hasn't been demonstrated. And average seat width is about 17 inches. So if you have that seat empty, then the distance from the aisle person's respiratory tract to the window person is about 34 inches. So that's less than 3 feet, less than 1 meter, and certainly a lot less than 6 feet or 2 meters. So it's actually not really achieving physical distancing. Then what about the airflow considerations on board? And this is being actively looked at by a couple of international groups at the moment. Remember that what our experience was that I presented earlier, that risk is low. And if you keep that empty seat, keep that middle seat empty, the maximum that you can achieve is about 62% seat occupancy. So as a maximum, that's really unsustainable probably. So we haven't recommended that, and nor has the CART, but we have recommended face coverings because that's increasingly, even by WHO, been accepted to be an effective form of source control. So you cover your face not to protect you, but to protect those around you from you. And that's been shown to be effective and certainly can reduce the forward displacement of droplets by about 90%. So we certainly endorse that. Next slide. And then the next interesting piece is about COVID-19 testing. So why not test people before they fly or after they fly or both? And this has been introduced in a number of areas around the world. To do it routinely requires, of course, first that the test can be done very reliably. If it's to occur at an airport, it would have to be done incredibly quickly as well and at large scale. Now, to date, we can achieve the reliability with PCR tests, which are the standard tests that all of you would mostly have in your community if you have symptoms. And it's what I had a week ago when I developed this cold that you can hear. That'll achieve the reliability, but it won't really achieve the speed at scale. And so at the moment, we can't achieve both together. It's a trade-off. Even if you could, the incubation period remains a challenge, and for the receiving country, that's an issue. So you can test negative at the time you fly, but now for the next 5 days, we don't know whether you're still incubating an infection that you got before you got tested. We think that the only practical way to do this is actually to do it before getting to the airport, and that's got some advantages, one of which is you know the result before you're packing your bags and leaving home. We know that there are some examples like the current business travel channel between Singapore and China where there are 2 tests. There's one pre-departure and one on arrival. Repeated testing with a nasal swab is pretty uncomfortable. And so it's good news that they're starting to field some tests based on a saliva test, which are far less uncomfortable to achieve. Australia has just fielded those publicly. So IATA's going to cautiously put this as part of the possibility, particularly if you're coming from a higher risk destination to a lower risk to introduce testing. And of course, finally, contact tracing is something that we're encouraging. I'm just off another webinar where we were discussing ways to facilitate that. So next slide, I think, might be my last, and that's, yeah, the last two things. Quarantine. This is very effective for preventing spread, but it really paralyzes aviation. So only 17% of travellers would still go if they have to have 2 weeks of quarantine. And this trade-off here becomes complex. So if you have two countries in which the community risk of COVID is similar, is it actually logical to quarantine arrivals because they're going from equivalent risk to equivalent risk? Even if you do still want to do that, could you lower that risk further with a test prior to travel? And that opens up sort of pathways for perhaps smarter quarantine in combination with testing. It's just an area that's under active discussion at the moment. And finally, just to cover off the question of antibodies and testing for immunity, as it were. Theoretically, this is great, but you don't get antibodies until a little bit later in the illness. Antibody testing is not any use for diagnosing whether people have COVID. It's to diagnose whether you've had it at some point previously. And most importantly, we don't yet know for how long people will be immune or how strong that immunity is. And it's possible that milder cases will have less immunity. Finally, there's a problem that if we start trying to have travel channels that are better for people who are immune, then we give an incentive for people to actually get the illness, and that will sort of run grave risk of undermining the public health efforts. So immunity passports probably will only be something that's useful in the context of a vaccine further down track. So Andrew, I think that might be my last slide, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll hand over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powell. Joseph is going to come back in now and take care of introducing Eva. So Joseph, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, David Powell, for giving us the evidence and the effectiveness of measures and the support IATA position during this pandemic and unprecedented crisis. We all know that our aviation industry is known for its regulatory requirements, standards, and recommended practices-driven operation. The next speaker will take us through what our industry and IATA do in terms of aircraft preparations for the flight to ensure that air travel remain the safest way of transportation even during the COVID pandemic. I would like to welcome Eva Prihushkova, Senior Manager Ground Operations Standards and Program Implementation, to brief us on IATA guidance for aircraft cleaning and disinfection. Eva, over to you.
Thank you, Joseph, and hello, everybody. I will be walking you today through IATA guidance for aircraft cleaning and disinfection during the pandemic and post-pandemic. Next slide, please. The cabin cleaning has never been previously scrutinized, as it didn't have any direct impact on flight safety. Until recently, of course, when we are facing the health risk. According to IATA passenger survey, which has been conducted in June, passengers are concerned about contracting the COVID on board, and they would feel much safer. 84% of them would feel much safer if aircraft went through thorough sanitation. it became clear for everyone that enhanced aircraft cleaning procedures will play one of the key role to reinstall passenger confidence. Next slide, please. IATA is about standards and promotion of common standards within industry. The Ground Operation Group has asked our team, Ground Operation team, to enhance current cabin cleaning procedure, which are published in IGOM, to include COVID measures. The need was very urgent as we started to see regulators publishing various guidances and regulations which haven't been harmonized across the board, and there were differences. Our team started to develop the guidance and IGOM was the base. But from regulatory point of view, we based it on ICAO CAR takeoff guidance, which we fully support. We take in consideration WHO recommendation, EASA guidelines, FAA, US CDC, as well as Chinese regulation, as they were the most detailed and advanced at the time we have started to develop our guidance. We developed it together with various stakeholders, gave it to also general public for comments, and published it in June. And at the end of the year, it will be included back to the IGOM for edition 10. As I mentioned, IATA advocate for the common standards. We promote fully implementation of CAR takeoff guidance, as well as IATA guidance for aircraft cleaning for procedures. And the reason is that we are trying to avoid any ambiguity and confusions. Within the industry, we can see that our members start to be overwhelmed with amount of guidance is published. Before I go to the next slide, I would ask Andrew if you could display the poll question. We will ask you for your opinion. So we would like to know, what do you think has really changed from previous cleaning procedures? You have 5 options: more areas to be clean, different cleaning and disinfection products, more people completing the job, cleaning of cargo hold, more time allocated, or higher frequency of cleaning. You can answer directly on your screen, and you can select all applicable options. I will give you a bit of time to reply the question. We would appreciate your participation because your opinion matters to us. And
Eva, just to let you know, you have about 30% of the people have voted so far.
So do we need to give a bit more time?
How about we do a countdown from 10? So, ladies and gentlemen, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close the poll now.
Thank you, Andrew, and we will come to the results a bit later. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what is our guidance about? We were aiming to address regulatory requirements, and yet we try to stay flexible so this guidance fit to all our members across the universe or board in various regions. Our main point is that everything needs to be risk-based, data-driven airline decision, and it should not be mandated or really stable or prescriptive, so it doesn't give any opportunity for members to adjust to their needs. Our guidance address cleaning topics such as cleaning personnel. We are focusing on personal protection and multi-layer approaches. Dr. Powell talked about them, so I don't have to go to the details. such as hygiene routines, distancing on job, how to practice it, use of PPEs, which we recommend. It's done on case by case. It's not applicable automatically to everyone, but depends on the risk and exposure. Other topic we are covering is competency of personnel and training, which is very difficult with limited amount of resources we currently have. And important topics include pandemic measures into the training, as well as operational changes. And one of the most important topic we are finding is human factor and safety risk with stress, reduce resources. We have to take in account that people might make a mistake. Other area is cleaning and disinfection products. It is recommended by ICAO CAR document to use 70% isopropyl alcohol. And we promote this. We are not promoting any specific product or brand. However, we describe the process that any product used needs to comply with SAE standard and it needs to be consulted and approved by the aircraft manufacturer. Also, it is important that use and health information provided by the product user are taken in account and people are aware and they are included to the procedures. Other area which we are covering are action before, during, and after cleaning. It's a set of rules, guidelines, and cautions which cleaning staff need to be aware and follow during the cleaning process. And one of the biggest portion of our guidance are task checklists. The task checklists include the task for the cleaning and disinfection, as well as location where these tasks should be performed. And the biggest focus is on touchpoint areas where the passenger and crew coming and touching and coming to the contact with the surfaces. For example, belt knuckle, knobs, handles, control panels, trays, shades, you can name it. So there is a comprehensive list for flight deck, cabin, including passenger cabin, crew seats, doors, panels, galleys, toilets, crew rest compartment, cleaning of cargo hold and ULDs. We also include procedures for confirmed or suspected COVID case on board, and procedures for transportation of live animals and dangerous goods spill. It's not necessarily COVID related, however, it seemed to be important from a safety perspective, and cargo team included this part. In terms of alternative disinfection methods, such as ionization, use of UV spraying, and others, we don't spend too much time at this stage as it's not yet approved aircraft manufacturers. And my colleague, Peter Este from Airbus, will provide us on update where we stand. And last big topic in our guidance is waste management, what to do in case with the waste related to COVID, as well as how to manage the waste at the airport. At this stage, Andrew, could you please show the poll results so we can look what our audience think has changed? So majority of you thinks that it's needed more time allocated for the cleaning and higher frequency and different cleaning and disinfection products. More areas to be clean is 19%, and the minority thinks that more people is needed for cleaning job and cleaning of cargo hold. Oh, pretty much everyone is right. And let's kind of summarize what the main changes are. Can we do next slide, please? So in principle, it's important to say that the usual cleaning procedure did not change. Nothing in ground operation changed rapidly in terms of procedures due to COVID. However, we are adding additional health measures and additional cleaning and disinfection measures, such as hygiene routines, physical distancing, use of PPEs, not job related by the COVID related. What is new is use of air conditioning before and during the cleaning to ensure clean air at the aircraft for the cleaning crew. We are focusing also on cleaning and disinfection of all equipment before and tools before use in the aircraft. We are using alcohol-based disinfectant, and disinfection routines have been added. Focus is in high touch points, and newly it has been introduced cleaning and disinfection of high touch points in cargo hold. That's very new, and we were doing research between our members. Cargo hold is usually clean only if there is a transportation of DGR or live animals, but as such never been really looked at from cleaning point of view, and now it's according to ICAO card recommended. And last, the new area is actually handover process after the cleaning. So cabin crew and flight crew can ensure the aircraft is clean. And ICAO card recommends aircraft cleaning and disinfection sheet. In conclusion of my presentation, there is a few things which I would like to emphasize. Any measures which we are taking shall be risk-based and data-driven. For that reason, we are not specifying the frequency of cleaning. We left the checklist with empty boxes, and every airline needs to do their risk assessment based on the location flown, based on the exposure of risk, based on the flight, number of passengers, and other elements. What kind of cleaning in which locations they will do on turnaround or layover. And measures should be progressive and adjusted to the existing situation. And I would like to really stress this part. At the initial stage of the restart of operation, we need to enhance the health measures and disinfections. We can agree to it, especially in some more exposed areas. However, we should not forget to reduce or remove the measure as the regional or global situation improves and risk is lower. In our industry, all of us can agree that we tend to introduce new procedures for specific situation, and then we are forgetting to remove it at the moment when it's not needed and becomes to be a new standard. We will advocate for that any measures should be removed if it's not needed, as all of us know that any additional steps, any additional people, procedure, and requirements are time and money. You can find our guidance on IATA ground operation site. You can see it on the screen. It's available for download. And our ground operation team is happy to assist anyone. We are answering regular inquiries from our industry. We welcome any type of feedback that serves for updating of our guidance besides of updates in the regulation. And I'll also be happy to take some question later on, as we didn't have time to go to the really details of the procedures. So I would like to thank you for attention, and back to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you for taking us into the improved cleaning routine with the aircraft, and hope to provide reassurance to our passenger and personnel as well, using the common industry standards and not complicating. These are the key to restart the operation and keeping the air travel safe with practical and cost-effective procedures. Now we turn to one of the aircraft manufacturers that play significant role in the implementation of the Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, what we call it the CART, supporting the public health corridor concept in the aircraft. The cleanliness of the aircraft as well as the air purity are on the top of the biggest passengers' concern. Please join me in welcoming Peter St, Head of Ground and Airport Safety Operation in Airbus, who will talk about the air circulation and the high efficiency particulate air filters, what we call it the HEPA, in the aircraft, as well as about the modern disinfection methods which are being tested in the aircraft interior. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And good morning, afternoon, evening from Toulouse in the south of France. I hope you're all doing well in wherever you are in the world. Restoring passenger trust is key to the recovery of aviation. That's clear to all of us. Airbus launched the Keep Trust in Air Travel campaign. It's a collective response to support a very quick restoration of aviation. For this campaign, we draw expertise from every department in Airbus, be it engineering, programs, customer services, R&T, marketing, and even our teams in the regions. We are exploring all kinds of ideas in line with our end-to-end approach to safety and our goal to exceed industry standards, so passengers who are ready to fly can feel reassured in doing so. We are working with the aviation associations, IATA, ACI, and also the regulators to build the guidelines and the procedures to protect the health and safety of passengers and crew all along the journey. This is our top and unconditional priority. As you have seen from the presentation from Eva, clean aircraft is very, very high. It's probably the highest concern of our passengers. So as Joseph already introduced, I would like to go through two subjects dealing with a virus-free aircraft. So we have a short video to show to you. Andrew, if you could start it. Yeah. The Airbus aircraft ensure the highest level of cabin air quality for passengers and crew. The airflow inside the cabin is continuously flowing from the top to the bottom in about 1 meter per second flow. In addition, during flight, the air is continuously renewed. The fresh air enters the cabin from outside, and the same quantity of air used air from the cabin is expelled overboard. In this way, we refresh the cabin air every 2 to 3 minutes. Under the floor, we have special high efficiency particle arrestor filters called HEPA, which clean the recirculated air before it is mixed with the fresh air from outside. So overall, the HEPA filters eliminate more than 99.9%.
Hello, Peter. I'm very sorry. Your video played all the way through, and I can't get it to go back to a specific point. Would you like to go into your slides? Peter, you're muted. I'm sorry. Can you come back into us?
Sorry for that. Can you go back to my slides then? Okay. So as already shown in the video, we have a very high flow from top to bottom. We ensure that every 2 to 3 minutes we refresh the air. If you compare it to a hospital room or a classroom, this is around every 10 minutes. And the office, where you're probably staying in right now, normally is refreshed in every 20 minutes. So a really high refresh rate. The air comes in from the top, as you see on this picture, and is extracted at floor level. And we have many entrance points and exit points all along the cabin. This means that the ventilation in the cabin is directed from the ceiling to the floor. The flow is down and rather than up. And it also creates a flow pattern that minimizes longitudinal flow, so back and forth. On top of this, the air supplied to the toilets, the galleys, and the cargo compartments is not recirculated. These compartments, the air is discharged directly overboard. And I think important for our area of ramp activities, on ground, we recommend to run the cabin ventilation using either the APU or a ground air conditioning unit when passenger or ground staff is on board. In fact, we should start the ventilation before passengers or staff are getting on board in order to refresh the air before they start working there. So then the second subject I would like to discuss with you is the disinfection. We know now the air in the cabin is very, very clean, but what about the surfaces in the cabin? Today, our recommendation is to use manual disinfection of the surfaces using the approved products we have in our maintenance manuals. We know that this method may have an impact on the turnarounds because it comes on top of cleaning. So it either requires more staff in order to keep the turnaround time as before, or you have to take more time. It also showed in the poll you just answered. So we're looking also now at alternative methods. And there are many alternative methods. There are different techniques to disinfect: thermal, fogging, spraying, ionization, H2O2, and ultraviolet. And there are also a lot of variations possible in how to apply those techniques on the aircraft. And on top of this, we have all kinds of local regulations. So we are convinced that there is no one size fits all answer for all of you. So what we're doing in Airbus right now is that we assess and we do perform tests of the different methods and techniques, and we will share our findings, what we think of those techniques. And we will advise on any precautions to be taken, and we'll for sure state any concern we have with the flight safety. So what are we really looking for is the compatibility of the method or the products with the aircraft structures, the systems, and the materials. But also the health impact on the operator applying the disinfection method, but also on passengers and crew, because many of those methods, they leave a product behind in the cabin. For sure, also the effectiveness of the product or the method to kill the virus in an aircraft environment. And then the benefits in terms of time and resources required to disinfect. So I would just take one example, ultraviolet method. We all know that ultraviolet is a very good killer of the virus, a good disinfectant. And it has a potential to go fast, and it could even be automated. But on the flip side for this, we need to check what this ultraviolet light is doing with the materials in the cabin. And also how this works for the more complex part of a cabin. You have the trays, you have the buckles. For ultraviolet light, you need to have a direct vision of the surface to be disinfected. If it is hidden, it doesn't work. So to go fast and kill the virus, you need to have a good intensity light level. The issue with that is that the higher intensity level you go for, the more impact we can expect to degrade the cabin materials. So we will have to find the compromises there. And there will be impact, and there will be maybe also a time impact for that. So we will inform the airlines of our progress, the testing, and our assessment for the various methods through in-service letters and webinars for our own customers, but we also share it with the ICAO card, which has been mentioned several times already, but also for the IATA, we are participating to the creation of the IATA guidelines for cleaning. So we will make sure you will get the information we have obtained. So my last slide. I presented you very, very briefly the disinfection methods we're looking at, and we will make sure that we will cover the complete aircraft with this. We're not just talking about the cabin itself, but for sure the cabin, the crew rest areas, the cargo areas, the lavatories. And we also look at other solutions, more linked to antimicrobial surface treatments. You can do that by polish, you can do that by coatings, or you can also think about new materials. These are probably a little bit more longer term solutions we will bring to you. So this concludes my presentation on keeping the aircraft clean, and I'm happy to take your questions at the end of the session. So back to you, Joseph.
Peter, thank you so much for very well articulated presentation and the assurances that Airbus is working on with the disinfection methods. It is very important for us to be able to support the CART public health corridor concept by providing a clean aircraft cabin environment for our passengers and vigorously promoting this health corridor concept through our social media channels. Knowing that we have a clean cabin, we also need to operate in a way that minimizes any risk, and it is the airline's responsibility to incorporate the different aspects of the guidance issued from the regulators. Here, to talk about the cabin operation aspects, I would like to welcome Jonathan Jasper, known as JJ, IATA's Manager Cabin Safety. JJ, over to you.
Thank you, Joseph, and hello to all the participants. Being in the pilot seat for a change, I am able to see who's here, so hello to any of our regular attendees at the conference and many of our contacts that have been helping us through this experience. What I want to do in my part of the presentation is just give you an insight as to how we've created the guidance, where we are with everything, and let you ask questions at the end of it. So I'm very aware that we're running low on time. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through my slides. I'm going to miss out the poll. So the first slide I'm going to skip through at the moment. Andrew, I know I do have your slides, so I'm just going to press page down. Thank you. Okay, so I was going to ask the passengers' greatest concerns, but we won't have time for that at the moment, but I will come back and touch on that. The reason we were going to ask this, the poll questions is because IATA is completing surveys among passengers. We've completed 3 so far, and we're monitoring and tracking their concerns so that we can address our guidance accordingly and our comms accordingly, which airlines can use to communicate with passengers too. So I did get asked earlier on in the process when we were issuing guidance, how did you come up with this? What is the process and where do you get your information from? Is it just me sitting in my spare bedroom in Montreal coming up with the guidance, or is there validation to it? So this slide explains our input processes. So on the left-hand side, we have the IATA extranet, which is a community which any of you as airlines, if you're watching this, can join and join the discussions. So we had discussions taking place on our extranet site. The next one down is a Microsoft Teams site. We have a Microsoft Teams site for our task force members, and we track the conversations there, and we have discussions and assess risks. My WhatsApp group, so the WhatsApp group on my mobile phone goes ballistic with communications from our airline members and discussions on various topics and various issues relating to processes during COVID. So we track the conversations there and we input the answers and all of the guidance that we have into the guidance material for the benefit of other member airlines. I also regularly monitor LinkedIn for consumer reaction to news stories, consumer reaction to other posts, to try and identify what is going on with the public perception of the professional aviation industry. So we address things in that and we try and get that included in the guidance. And the last part there was the CART takeoff guidance. Now, the CART takeoff guidance came after IATA's guidance. IATA's first guidance was issued in April and CART came out in June. But the collaboration between the two is most of our input was adopted into CART as well. So we're very much aligned on our thinking and processes. So I put on the screen there the 2 guidance materials that I created initially, guidance for cabin operations during pandemic and the guidance for crew health precautions during the pandemic. Initially, we had them both in the one, but then we split them off to make sure that we could easily demonstrate how they're aligned with CART. So these are the 2 main guidances that I've created, and we've had input into all of the others that you've seen along the way. So really the point of this slide is to demonstrate that we have a process, we have input from many people, and then we output the guidance. And with the cabin operations guidance, we're currently drafting edition 4 with other issues that have been identified through all of these processes. So always make sure you have the latest copy of the guidance that we've issued. My next slide, there seems to be a bit of a delay, but I'm just moving through. I'm trying to move through. Andrew, are you able to move the slides down? Because yes, there we go. So once we've identified through the discussions, we also then try and put them all into some sort of order. So we always adopt a risk assessment process, and our risk assessment to kind of categorize and prioritize all of these issues is included in our guidance material. So we'll always have the risk assessment, and we've started to introduce that in all of our other documents as well. So on the screen there, you can see the web link, and we'll make sure you've got a list of those websites at the end of it. So I'm going to go through to the next one. Once we've identified the concerns and then we've completed our risk assessment, we're looking at these are the factors that we identified within that process that could help mitigate the risk of spread of infection on board the aircraft. And this is what we have put into our comms, which you may well have seen this image or this slide going out on various social media channels, and airlines have access to use this within their own communications too. And it reiterates what Peter was showing in his video, and it reiterates some of the factors that Dr. Powell mentioned. So seats and passengers face forward, seat backs act as a solid barrier. That's a difficult one to say. Research suggests that transmission is very low, and we also have the HEPA filters. So there are many factors that reduce the risk on board the aircraft. Let me just try the next one. So from those factors and assessing the risks, we identified the mitigations. So the mitigating measures that we have in place are mandatory masks for crew and face coverings for passengers. That's what IATA recommends. A simplified catering procedure that lowers crew movement and interaction with passengers. That would be applicable to a higher risk route. Limiting movement within the cabin during flight, so restricting or reducing movement as much as possible around the cabin to avoid disrupting airflow, and more frequent and deeper cabin cleaning. So these are the measures that we've implemented or recommended for airlines to reduce the risk on board the aircraft. And the note on the bottom of the slide, IATA does not recommend restricting the use of the middle seat to create physical distancing while on board the aircraft. It's a layered approach, all of these measures that help reduce the risk. So those are our published positions that we have separate papers for and are incorporated into all of our guidance. And let's see some of the issues. I often get asked, should cabin crew be wearing more than masks? And so our answer is that additional personal protective equipment is recommended only if it's appropriate to the route or the carriage of known infectious cases. So only what is necessary and appropriate. So way back in the beginning, another airline asked, how come I have so much guidance coming out? It's so very confusing. And if airlines are confused with all of the guidance, then the image at the bottom there is representing the passengers. The passengers are going to be confused too. And that is what we see on LinkedIn. That is what we see on Facebook, all of the social media channels. So this slide is to demonstrate that we have ICAO at the top there with annexes, SARPs, and the CART guidance. So they're producing that. In addition to that, that is then translated or adapted by the state aviation regulators, for example, FAA, EASA, and so on. In addition to that, because aviation regulation doesn't cover specifically health cases, we have the health authorities and the governments adding on their local procedures, and we also have the World Health Organization. And then our job as IATA is to kind of translate all of these into a message that can be understood by our airlines and implemented to try and standardize as much as possible. We also produce the IATA standards and the ISAGO ground operation standards, and these they only cover safety, they don't cover health specifically. So this is where we are with all of our guidance, which we give to the airlines, and the passengers potentially will be confused. So the factors affecting the global harmonization of all of those inputs of regulations and standards are that the infection rates are different around the world. So passengers traveling globally may come from a high-risk area, go to a low-risk area, or vice versa. So the procedures that are adopted by the airlines, in accordance with all the recommendations, will vary throughout their journey. And they don't necessarily know that. They don't understand the difference between the procedures adopted by all. In addition to that, you've got interpretation of recommendations. Always we have recommendations and different people will read them differently. Regulatory complexity, is it guidance or is it a regulation? And this is the issue that the airlines are facing, because most of it is guidance rather than the regulatory framework doesn't support this type of activity. So airlines are caught in, do I do this? Do I have to do this? Will I be penalized if I don't do this? And that then leads them into the social cultural acceptance and expectations from their passengers. We know that in various parts of the world, it's far more normal and more acceptable to be seen wearing a mask at all times, whereas we know that the opposite end of the spectrum is that people really do not want to wear masks and refuse to. So these are all the factors that will affect the passengers when they're flying on board our aircraft. We are currently operating an airline member survey about these regulations to see how they are being adopted by their local authorities. And which of the following are mandated by your regulator? We had 34 individual country or state responses. These were from the airlines in individual states. And we can see out of 34 that the majority are requiring face coverings. We still have a high number requiring additional sanitizers. We have a low number mandating seats must be kept empty, and that is encouraging that it's all aligned predominantly with the CART guidance. A lavatory must be blocked for crew use in small number of cases. Passenger use of lavatory must be limited. In other words, that's restricting the movement around the cabin. And an area on board must be reserved for quarantine. We just need to clarify that question in the next round of the survey, because many airlines said, yes, only if there is a suspected case, we need to quarantine the passenger. So what's encouraging from this is that face coverings, IATA's recommendation, is adopted in 28 out of the 34 countries that were identified. On the other end of the scale, we have on the next slide, a little bit of help from Andrew here, I hope. The next slide relates to which of the following crew precautions are mandated by your regulator. So again, face coverings is mentioned quite highly. Gloves in some cases, 15 out of 34, so around about 50%. A small number requiring goggles or visors, but a little bit higher number requiring additional clothing, over sleeves and suits. And that's the one I highlighted in red because, again, that is the one that passengers will clearly see when they board the aircraft if the cabin crew are wearing these suits. But whether it's acceptable to them or not depends on their social and cultural state, if you like. So what they're used to seeing and their perception of whether that is protecting them or whether that is protecting the crew members. And 7 out of these 34 say none are mandated, it's all up to the airline's decision. And that's fair enough as long as the airlines understand their risk assessment process and they take their responsibility for the crew precautions. So I'm very aware we are 10 minutes over time. So I'm going to go to the next slide, Andrew, please. And we'll make sure that Catherine gets a chance to speak too. We do monitor LinkedIn and we do monitor other social media channels. And this is where we're seeing compliance issues. We had a very good post from United Airlines there just saying, just wear a mask. And we know that there are many people that refuse to wear a mask. We did predict this back in our April version of the guidance. And now we are going to start recommending to airlines to, get passengers' acceptance to wear a mask at the point of check-in. So when they check in for the flight, we recommend that they just tick the box to say, I agree to wear a mask. And if they don't agree to wear a mask, then we have to look at moving them to another flight. So we are seeing an increase in compliance issues and a lot of social media interest, maybe not necessarily comparative to the problems that we've seen, but nevertheless, it's all publicity, which doesn't help to restore confidence. Next slide. We have a website updated. We give advice to travelers and we also give advice to the airlines. So there is IATA advice for travelers, which airlines can use and travelers, the passengers themselves, can use as well. So when you go to IATA.org, you go to You and IATA and you select travelers. And it has a lot of the coronavirus frequently asked questions and guidance that's provided by IATA. I'm just going to try the next slide. In summary, the guidance is created with full input from member airlines. IATA's position on face masks and physical distancing is mentioned. Evidence shows that this is being implemented by many states. We have a lot of resources and regular passenger surveys. So we will be here for questions. We will take any questions and we'll provide answers to them after the event if necessary. But we are continuing the webinar. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass back to Joseph.
JJ, thank you. Thank you so much for the insight on the cabin operation guidance. But before we proceed further, ladies and gentlemen, we are extending the webinar by 30 minutes. Please stay with us if you can. Back to you, JJ. As you mentioned, it was developed with the input from the Cabin Operations Safety Task Force, who are a dedicated team of airline safety professionals who help you keep up to date with operational challenges. So now I would like to welcome the acting chair of the Cabin Operations Safety Task Force, Catherine Chan, Group Safety Manager, Operational Safety, Cathay Pacific Airways, to present an airline's perspective of operating during a public health emergency. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you, everyone, for staying back with the extended time that we have with the webinar. So I'll need Andrew's help to probably move through the slides to make sure that the transition is as smooth as possible. So among all of us in the technical group, there are about 16 members. We do talk a lot about the risk factor when it comes to embracing the new norm. So there are three areas that the group always talk about, and we keep close working contact with IATA. The three areas are very important is that for you to review the books. Is your policy, your current policy, process, and procedures still effective? We understand that a lot of airlines are actually, a lot of their staff are working from home. There's a reduced manpower and resources, but it's very, very critical to understand what are the guidance provided by ICAO, your state regulators, the health authority, CDC, the government, and of course, as what mentioned by JJ and also Dr. Powell, what are the guidelines available to help you to continue your operations? So that's number one. Go back to your books and see if your procedures, your policy, and your process are still effective. The second area you probably like to consider is to look at the gaps. Very important, as mentioned by JJ just now, the factors affecting global harmonization. What is appropriate? What is sufficient? So looking at the different geographical areas and also the rate of infection, more mitigations may be required. You will probably have to have a team in place who actually monitor the movement, the changes around the geographical areas that you plan to continue your service or plan to reintroduce your service. The third area, very important, which is the people. What is best for your crew and what is best for your customers. Understanding the elements affecting their well-being is absolutely critical. Dr. Powell, Eva, and also JJ, and also we talk about how the air circulations and all that really affects the well-being of the people that works for you and the people who's going to travel with you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we need to appreciate that there are 4 areas that airlines are looking at when it comes to passenger experience. That includes boarding, communicating with customer, in-flight, and disembarkations. These 4 areas actually have huge impact on your passengers' experience. Bear in mind that when the passengers are boarding, they've already gone through, as mentioned earlier on, temperature screening, symptom screening. They've already prepared themselves as much as possible to brave the travel. So there will be a lot of passengers and also staff who, especially passengers, who are confused because there's overload with information and there's a high level of anxiety. The reason is being habit is hard to change and habits is personal. So it starts from checking in and boarding. The next area that from an airline perspective and customer experience is that how are we going to communicate with our customers, especially during before takeoff. We always have passenger safety briefing. So when is it appropriate to remove the mask, for example, during depressurization? Or how would you help passengers if they need to don on life jackets in the event of emergency? Because now you'll find that a lot of passengers will have extra clothing on or extra protections, like they will probably come into the aircraft cabin with a disposable raincoat. We also have seen passengers brought additional cleaning agents to help themselves, or disinfecting agents, as toiletries, alcohol rub and all that. So communicating with passengers and all your customers will be one of the biggest challenge, and this will actually affect the experience with an airline in flight. Where there are some recommendations saying that there's a need to manage passenger expectations. We have recommendations like how your lavatory is going to be serviced. How about the use of the personal TV, touchscreens TV, the tray tables? How about the separations, the seats? How many people will be sitting in a row? So in flight, it's even more important for you to be extra sensitive with your passengers and your crew needs. Some areas, geographical areas, actually, for example, IATA, there's some recommendations actually say that, well, perhaps you need to review the service of alcohol and also how your passengers will move around in the cabin. So this is all the in-flight experience by your passengers, which most of us, unless we travel, we won't feel that uncertainty, confusion, and anxiety. Moving on, passengers disembarkation. What are the areas that you may need to look into? I'll give you an example. Some aircraft are prone to teethering, where there's aircraft movement as passengers leave the aircraft. So you may have to prepare passengers to communicating with customers how to best when they need to leave the aircraft. We also have airlines which actually mention that there is a delay in disembarkation upon arrival. Passengers sometimes are kept in the cabin. They are asked to be seated while waiting for the check-in baggage to be offloaded and made available in the baggage belt. This is simply just to ensure that the passengers won't wait too long in the baggage carousel, and also to ensure that there's sufficient social distancing. So these are the areas that you may need to consider when it comes to passengers' experience, and by trying to protect the well-being of both your crew and the passengers. So moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So there seems to be a lot that airlines needs to go through, but there are three key actions that you might want to consider, which is number one, risk assessments. Try to find out what are the common issues faced by your frontline staff, and also look back into your previous reports and see what are the areas of concerns, and also to review how ready is your airline to go back into full service. Once you've completed a risk assessment, it's important to close the gaps. Refer back to ICAO card or IATA guidance material, references from your health authority, or WHO or CDC. Very important, the third part of the action is that look at your crew reporting. They are telling you a story that you need to look deeper and monitor and review and update them consistently. This will actually help you to enhance and continue to reassure your passengers' experience. Okay, next slide, please. What we're trying to say here is that it's very important to create a solid foundation when you return to your operations. We are embracing this new norm, and only with a solid foundation, you could continue to build on it, and you could ensure that your passenger experience will continue to excel. There's one area that I like to share with all of you is that there are common risks when it comes to airline operations. These common risks includes staff recency and currency, your staff well-being. It is this new modified work environment which will impact your passengers' experience. The different equipment that you use, PPEs, gloves, masks. How ready is your supplier? Because that will also impact on your overall passengers' experience with you. Resource and productivity with quarantine requirements and all that. You may not have 100% of your crew or your ground staff available to provide the service that your passengers expect. How about ongoing oversight and assurance? In addition, you also need not to forget about your emergency response plan, because during this new norms environment, the last thing you want to sort of like put aside is actually your emergency response plan. It will all have impact on the people who's helping you to continue your service and the people who trust you and is going to fly with you again. So that is the last slide. I hope the information I've provided you some insights and how the entire cabin operation technical group works together. And like what JJ said, there's always a lot of discussion through WhatsApp and through communications that we try to, very important, to focus on progress. Where do we move from here? Thank you very much.
Catherine, thank you so much. Thank you for the very useful information that airlines might need to consider. Okay, now, so please stay with us as we invite questions from the audience. I would like to welcome Andrew Price, IATA Head Global Baggage Operations, to moderate the question and answer. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Well, hello everybody to our special extended webinar. We will be going through a few of the questions that have been received and approved by our legal team now. Could I ask all of the panelists to turn your webcams on, please, and also to make sure you are not muted? That will allow us to hear from you. Welcome back, everybody. It's a very global panel today, by the way. We have speakers from Montreal through to Hong Kong through to New Zealand. So, and stopping off, of course, in France on the way. So we have a huge geographical spread. Now, anybody, of course, can feel happy. Anybody who feels happy to answer any of these, go ahead. Where I think it's addressed to a specific person, I'll single that person out. The first one here is, do we think that the industry has been successfully capable of educating passengers and health authorities? The person who's asking this is actually from South America, and they feel that a stronger campaign could have been useful there. So anybody have any comments on the success in general of educating authorities on the medical issues that we face? Let's start off with Dr. David Powell.
I think it's always impossible to communicate enough, and it's very hard to get these messages across, especially when they're sometimes difficult to understand. We just had a webinar about this today with one of the aircraft manufacturers, and we're trying together to present some of the data about cabin air in a way that people can understand. Yep, constant challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Does anyone else have something to say about the effectiveness of the flow of information? I can see you have your hand up, Jonathan.
Yes, I will. Obviously, IATA is a global organization and we have regional offices as well. And those regional offices are tasked with maintaining a relationship with the local regulators. So the local regulators, if they introduce something that's different to CART, then the regional office will fight that case to make sure that it's harmonized and standardized. And we are doing that certainly within South America and within Europe as well at the moment. So we are monitoring and tracking, and we are doing all we can to communicate with them. With regards to passenger awareness, well, IATA doesn't communicate directly with passengers very often, and so we would rely on the airlines to do that and support the messaging that comes out from IATA. We do try to communicate with customers, passengers, but we rely on the airlines to have that messaging system with their own passengers and customers.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Now, there's a question here that I know Dr. Powell and I have discussed in the past, so I'm going to raise it for you to answer, Dr. Powell, and that is there any special procedure for sanitizing passenger and crew baggage?
No, our advice from health authorities is that that's not a plausible way of transmitting infection. And so I think the concern was, might passengers or baggage handlers catch something off the baggage? But all of what we've seen about surfaces indicates that the likelihood of transmitting via a surface declines the longer the delay is between the source and the recipient touching the same surface. So, so time is a critical factor there. But no special procedures.
Thanks, David. So now having a look here, there's a couple of questions that would be very good for Peter, I feel. The first one is the airflow that you talk about in the aircraft. From what year has that been standard? How many models of the Airbus aircraft has that been the case? And it's got a follow-up, which is actually asked by somebody else, and that is how much fresh air is mixed with recycled air in the cabin? So if you could just touch on those two, it'd be very good. Please, Peter.
Okay, I hope you can hear me well, because I see I'm facing some problems with the internet connection. But first question about when did we introduce this? The filters have been introduced very, very early. There are maybe some 310 and 600s which are still flying without filters, but they're probably more freight aircraft. So they've been introduced very, very early. And also the air conditioning flow, the flow you have seen, this has always been like this, because behind nothing to do with the COVID, but this has been an issue, always a concern we have treated seriously right from the start, is to make sure that the airflow is very, very well directed, so that you do not transmit anything, smells or viruses or bacteria in the cabin. So I think all our aircraft today, with some exceptions, they are equipped and they have the ventilation system as I've presented.
Thank you very much, Peter. So there's a question here which is about the airline perspective. So Catherine, this one is coming towards you. What are you doing between flights? It's all well and good. You can make the aircraft wonderfully safe, but if they then arrive into a hotel, what happens and what special precautions are being taken in those places?
It really depends where you're the airline base and whether it's the destination, the exposure to infection and all that. So with regards to crew, we work very closely with the government and also the CDC, and we also take a lot of recommendations from ICAO and IATA. The crew actually will follow all the very stringent requirements from here in Hong Kong, and at the same time, we also need to respect the recommendations at the port of arrival. So crew will given specific guidelines. Unfortunately, because these guidelines change all the time, depending on the infection rates and all that, I think it won't be fair for me to sort of like be very specific about it. And it really based on the assessment, the risk assessments done by various governments. So the recommendation I could provide is that make sure that you're always updated yourself with the requirement in the destination. What does the local CDC expects, and also review what your health authorities require you to do.
Thank you very much. And this is my last question before I hand back to Joseph to just wrap everything up. Could each of you spend 5 seconds, no more, talking about what your key takeaway from this pandemic has been? So let's start off with Jonathan first, then Peter, then Eva, then Catherine, and then Dr. David Powell. So Jonathan.
My key takeaway of this whole process is never to be taken by surprise again. I was expecting to be sitting at home doing self-study courses and so on, and I have never been busier coordinating so many different activities to help airlines. So that's my takeaway from this pandemic.
Thank you, Jonathan. Peter, what's your takeaway?
clearly the takeaway is that health is going to be a requirement like we have today, of safety and safety, and health to this for the next years to come.
Thank you, Peter. You broke up on my connection there, but I think everyone else could still hear you. Eva, what's your takeaway?
For me, it's surprising that despite of all emergency response and practicing, we are never prepared, and we are taken usually by surprise. As JJ mentioned, same here, we are extremely busy supporting members in non-standard situations and creating guidelines. And speed is an essence, speed and coordination across the industry, because firstly we were paralyzed, no one was doing much, and suddenly everyone is trying to help, and we are having various guidelines, materials, regulations, and now is the role of IATA via our regions to actually make sure that we have just few of them which are to follow globally by everyone.
Thank you, Eva. Catherine?
I think I always say this, aviation starts with people, ends with people. Appreciate your team that is there to help you. Always look around to see who you could help and who could help you. And at the same time, we must stay strong. I mean, we've overcome so many challenges before, and we must not give up. I think that's very, very crucial.
Excellent thoughts. Thank you, Catherine. And finally, Dr. David Powell, what's your takeaway from this whole crisis and pandemic?
The deadlock that we're in is going to be so hard to get out of, but I think that one of the keys to it will be smarter quarantine, which will involve testing technologies. And it won't be perfect, but nothing's perfect in COVID.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Powell. Joseph, please, would you like to wrap up for us today?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Andrew, for moderating the question and answer. Thank you all for our speakers and for the audience questions. Thank you again for staying connected with us, and thank you for the attention and input. Don't forget that all of our guidance materials and communication tools are available for you to download on our IATA.org website. For those companies who would appreciate a bit more personalized help, IATA can also provide customized training by the IATA Training Department using e-learning and also IATA consulting services. If you have any other questions or comments relating to the content of this webinar, you can contact us on the email address shown on the screen. If you are representing an airline, you can also join the discussion and keep up to date with changes by joining our cabin safety extranet and also ground ops community. Thank you for your time and attention. Please keep safe. Please keep well.
And thank you, Joseph. Thank you for everybody who stayed with us. We still have 280 people on. That's more than have attended some of the other webinars. Thank you again. I am now going to close everything. So if everyone wishes to wave, I will be ending the webinar right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.